April opt, omianoa suta noa zet shishapte. The date is etched into the stone of history, not for what happened in the light, but for what began in the dark. It was a Tuesday, in the rural sprawl of Chang'an County. The transition from day to night was usually a gentle thing. The sun would dip below the horizon, the color would bleed out of the sky, and the world would turn gray, then blue, then black. It was a rhythm, a promise that tomorrow would look exactly like today. But in Shanghai village, the night didn't fall. It descended. It had weight. Inside a small, modest home near the edge of the village, the air was stagnant. It smelled of boiled cabbage, vinegar, and the metallic tang of old iron. A mother sat by the window. Her name is lost to the wider record, overshadowed by the tragedy of her child. But her grief is the anchor of this story. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white, the skin pulled tight over the bone. On the table behind her, dinner was waiting. 3 bowls, 3 pairs of chopsticks, a pot of soup that had stopped steaming an hour ago. A film of congealed fat had formed on the surface of the broth, an ugly, stagnant skin that mirrored the feeling growing in the pit of her stomach. She was listening. The human ear is a miraculous thing. It can filter out the wind rattling the loose pane of glass. It can ignore the distant bark of a farm dog or the hum of the refrigerator. It tunes itself to the one frequency that matters. For this mother, that frequency was the specific, rhythmic times, chink 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 times of a bicycle chain, and the sharp, cheerful ring of a bell. It was a sound she heard every day at 6:30 p.m. It was now 7:45 p.m. The silence in the room was not empty. It was crowded. It was filled with every worst-case scenario a parent's mind can manufacture in the quiet hours. Her daughter, Jia Shaoni, was 18 years old. In the geography of 1997, 18 was an adult. But in the geography of a mother's heart, she was still a child. Jia was not the type to wander. She was not a rebel. She didn't have a secret boyfriend waiting by the creek, and she didn't stop at the roadside stalls to gamble or gossip. She was quiet, obedient, a girl who walked the straight line, drawn for her by tradition and expectation. Her life was a simple loop. Home, the factory, home. The factory was close. A 10-minute ride on a bicycle, maybe 15 if the wind was against her. It was a short tether. It was supposed to be safe. The mother stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. She went to the door and opened it. The night air rushed in, cold and indifferent. She looked out into the lane. It was empty. Just the dust swirling in the breeze and the shadows of the poplar trees stretching out like long, thin fingers. "She's late," the mother said. It wasn't a statement. It was a plea. Her husband, Jia's father, was sitting in the corner, smoking a cigarette. The smoke hung in a blue haze around his head. He was trying to be the rock. He was trying to be the rational man who didn't jump to conclusions. "She probably had a flat tire," he said. His voice was rough, dry. "Or the chain popped. You know that bike is old. She's probably walking it back." "She would have been here," the mother said, not turning from the darkness outside. "She would have been here by now. Maybe overtime," the father suggested, though he knew it was a lie. The factory didn't do overtime on Tuesdays. "She would have told us." The mother turned back to him. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of panic. The fear was contagious. It jumped from her to him, a spark leaping across a gap. He crushed the cigarette out in a ceramic dish, twisting it until the ember died. "I'll go look," he said. He stood up, grabbing his jacket. He moved with a forced casualness, trying to pretend that this was just an annoyance, just a father going to scold a tardy daughter. But his hands were shaking as he zipped the jacket. He knew, deep down, in the reptilian part of the brain that senses predators, he knew. The soup sat on the table, cold and dead. The father took his own bicycle. He pedaled out of the village, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel path. The sound was deafening in the quiet night. Asterisk crunch, 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 asterisk. He pedaled hard. He wanted to see her silhouette emerging from the gloom. He wanted to see her walking her bike, looking frustrated, maybe a little embarrassed. He rehearsed what he would say. He would shout at her first, out of relief, and then he would fix the chain and they would ride home together. But the road was empty. The beam of his flashlight cut a weak, yellow cone through the darkness. It illuminated patches of weeds, rocks, and the unending wall of wheat that lined the road. The wheat fields in Chang'an County were vast, miles and miles of stalks, standing shoulder to shoulder. In the daylight, they were an ocean of gold, a symbol of harvest and life. But at night, they changed. At night, the wheat became a curtain, a veil. It stood tall, higher than a man's waist, whispering in the wind. Asterisk, swish, swish, asterisk. It felt like the fields were watching him. He reached the factory in record time, his chest heaving, sweat cooling instantly on his forehead. The gate was closed. The facility was dark, save for a single bulb burning over the security booth. He abandoned his bike, letting it clutter to the ground, and ran to the booth. He hammered on the glass. The night shift guard, an old man with a face like crumpled paper, jumped. He slid the window open, blinking against the cold. "Where is she?" the father demanded. "My daughter, Jia Xiaoni. Is she still inside?" The guard frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Jia? No. No one is inside." The line stopped at 6. "Did you see her leave?" The guard nodded slowly. He reached for a logbook, flipping a page with a wet thumb. I saw her. She clocked out at 6 to 10. I remember because she waved. She had that red scarf on." The father felt his knees go weak. He gripped the ledge of the window to stay upright. 6:10, the father whispered. That was 2 hours ago." "She went that way," the guard said, pointing a gnarled finger toward the south. "Toward the village, toward home. She rode out. I watched her go until she turned the bend. She was alone. Alone." The word hung in the air like smoke. "She never made it home," the father said. His voice broke. The guard's expression shifted from annoyance to pity, and then to something sharper, concern. He looked past the father, into the darkness beyond the gate light. "You should call the police," the guard said softly. The father didn't wait. He ran back to his bike. The ride back was different. The hope was gone. Now, there was only the hunt. He scanned the ditches. He stopped every 100 yards, shining his light into the tall grass, screaming her name. "Xiaoni, Xiaoni." The wind took his voice and tore it apart. The field swallowed the sound. There was no answer, just the rustle of the dry stalks. Asterisk, swish, swish, asterisk. By 10 p.m., the village of Shanghai was awake. Panic in a small community is a wildfire. It starts with a spark, a missing girl, and the wind carries it from door to door. Neighbors came out onto their porches, wrapping coats over their pajamas. Flashlights flickered on, beams crisscrossing in the night. The family rallied the relatives, uncles, cousins, brothers-in-law, men with strong backs and grim faces. They gathered in the Jia courtyard, their breath misting in the cold air. They divided the territory like generals planning a war. "Check the irrigation ditches," one uncle said. "Maybe she fell." "Check the old storage sheds," another suggested. "I'll take the main road," the father said. He looked haunted. His eyes were hollowed out. Someone must have seen her. They moved out in a phalanx, a line of light pushing back the dark. They knocked on doors. They woke up farmers who stared out with bleary eyes, shaking their heads. No, they hadn't seen a girl. No, they hadn't heard a crash. Then, a break. A small, fragile thread of information. A coworker lived 3 miles down the road. She had been riding behind Jia for a while. The family hammered on her door until she answered, terrified. "Yes," the coworker said, clutching her robe at her throat. "I saw her. We rode together until the fork. She turned left, toward the wheat fields." The father felt the blood drain from his face. The wheat fields, the shortcut. It was a 2-kilometer stretch of isolation, a dirt path that cut through the heart of the crops. It shaved 10 minutes off the ride, but it was desolate. No houses, no lights, just the earth and the sky and the endless, swaying grain. Why? The father moaned. Why did she take the shortcut? It was cold, the coworker whispered. She just wanted to get home. The search party turned toward the fields. They left the paved road and stepped into the dirt. The atmosphere changed immediately. The village lights receded, becoming distant stars. The silence here was absolute, heavy and suffocating. They walked abreast, 10 yards apart. They swept their lights back and forth. Jauni? Jia Shauni. They looked for signs. A tire track. A dropped glove. A red scarf. The wheat towered over them. It was dense. You could hide an army in there. You could hide anything. The father walked in the center. He was scanning the ground, his eyes burning. Every shape looked like a body. A pile of rocks became a shoulder. A bundle of straw became a leg. His heart hammered against his ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. He found nothing. They walked the entire 2 kilometers. They reached the other side, where the path rejoined the main road near the village entrance. They stood there, bafflingly, at the edge of safety. If she had taken this path, she should have popped out right here. She should have been home. Maybe she turned back, an uncle said, his voice lacking conviction. Maybe she's at a friend's house and the phone lines are down, another lied. The father stared at the ground. The dirt was churned up by footprints, by bicycle tires, by the passage of time. The history of the evening was written in the mud, but it was a language he couldn't read. The batteries in their flashlights began to dim. The beams turned from white to a sickly yellow, then to a dying orange. The darkness was winning. It pressed in on them, heavy and cold. "We can't see anything," a cousin said gently. "We have to wait for light." "I'm not leaving," the father said. But he couldn't fight the physics of light. One by one, the torches died. The darkness became total. They had to retreat. They had to go back to the house where the soup was still sitting on the table, now covered in a layer of dust. That night, no one slept. The mother sat by the window, staring at the empty lane. The father sat by the door, holding a baseball bat, waiting for a monster he couldn't name. April Noa. April Zeche. April Unsprezeche. The waiting. There is a specific kind of torture reserved for the families of the missing. It is worse, in many ways, than grief. Grief is a wall. You hit it, you collapse, and eventually, you learn to climb it. Missing is a fog. You can't climb it. You can't fight it. You just wander in it, blind, swinging at ghosts. The police were notified immediately, of course. 2 officers from the local station came out. They took notes. They looked bored. "She probably ran off," one officer said, snapping his notebook shut. 18 years old? Maybe she met a boy. Maybe she went to the city for work. It happens all the time. "Not Gia," the father said, his voice trembling with a suppressed rage. "She isn't like that. They're all like that, eventually," the officer said. But the village mobilized. The skepticism of the police didn't stop the neighbors. They knew Gia. They knew she wasn't a runner. For 3 days, the village became a grid. They combed the woods. They poked sticks into the river. They walked the wheat fields again and again, in the daylight this time. The wheat whispered. Asterisk. Swish. Swish. Asterisk. It gave up nothing. The wind blew across the plains, carrying the scent of fertilizer and damp earth. It didn't carry the scent of death. Not yet. On the 4th day, the waiting ended. April 12. It was late afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, golden rays across the tops of the wheat. A local woman, Mrs. Chen, was walking home. She was taking a shortcut, cutting through a patch of the field less than 100 yards from the entrance to Shangbei village. She was thinking about dinner. She was thinking about her aching feet. She stepped off the path to avoid a muddy patch. Pushing through the stalks, the wheat parted around her. She stopped. Her brain couldn't process the image at first. It rejected it. It tried to tell her she was looking at a mannequin, or a pile of discarded clothes, or a scarecrow knocked down by the wind. But the smell hit her before the realization did. It was a sweet, cloying, meat-heavy smell. The smell of a barbecue gone wrong. The smell of singed hair and cooked fat. Mrs. Chen looked down. The scream that tore out of her throat was not human. It was the sound of a mind snapping. She scrambled backward, tripping over her own feet, falling into the dirt. She crawled, scrabbling at the earth, her fingernails tearing, trying to get away from the thing in the grass. She fainted before she reached the road. The police arrived within the hour. This time, there was no boredom. There was no talk of runaways. The first officer on the scene, a veteran named Sergeant Liu, stepped into the wheat. He had seen death before. He had seen car accidents, farm mishaps, bar fights that went too far. He thought he was hardened. He wasn't ready for this. He pushed the stalks aside and froze. His hand went to his mouth, stifling a gag reflex that rose up violent and acidic. He had to look away, staring at the horizon, breathing through his mouth until the nausea passed. "Jesus," he whispered, "Mother of God." It was a tableau of pure sadism. Jia Xiaoni lay on her back. She was hidden well, nestled deep in the tall wheat, invisible from the road just 10 feet away. Her eyes, that was what the sergeant couldn't look at. They were bulging from their sockets, staring blindly at the indifferent blue sky. They were filled with hemorrhages, red bursting through the white. Her tongue was swollen, purple, protruding from between her teeth. She had been strangled, not just choked, crushed. The force required to do this defied imagination. It wasn't just about cutting off air. It was about destruction. The hyoid bone, the cartilage, the windpipe, everything had been ground to dust under a pair of thumbs. But that was only the beginning. Her clothes were torn to ribbons. Her pants were pulled down, tangled around her ankles. Her shirt was shoved up. She had been violated. The brutality of the assault was evident in the bruising, the tears, the dirt ground into her skin. And then, the fire. The killer hadn't just taken her life. He had tried to erase her. He had set fire to her lower body. The flames had not been large enough to consume her entirely. The dampness of the field had likely stifled them, but they had done enough. The flesh was charred, blackened, peeling away to reveal the bone beneath. The smell was thick in the air. It mixed with the damp earth, creating a sensory memory that would haunt every man standing in that field for the rest of his life. The sergeant stepped back, waving his men forward. "Don't touch anything," he barked, his voice shaking. "Get the detectives from Xi'an. Get them now." He looked down at the ground. Her wallet was gone. Her bicycle was gone. It looked like a robbery, a petty theft, a crime of opportunity. But the sergeant knew better. You don't burn a body for 20 yuan. You don't strangle a girl until her eyes pop out for a used bicycle. This was hatred. This was a storm of violence contained within a human skin. The Xi'an homicide detectives arrived as the sun went down. They brought lights, cameras, and the cold, clinical detachment of professionals. Lead Detective Wang crouched by the body. He wore latex gloves that snapped as he pulled them on. He touched the victim's neck, feeling the devastated tissue. "He attacked from behind," Wang said quietly to his partner. He pointed to the bruising pattern. "See this?" He knocked her off the bike. Ambush. She never saw him coming. He moved his hand to her chest. Broken ribs. He knelt on her. He pinned her down with his full weight. "He's heavy, or he's incredibly strong." "She fought," the partner noted, pointing to the dirt under Jia's fingernails. "She scratched him." "Didn't matter," Wang said. "He was too fast. He choked her out before she could scream. That's why no one heard anything." Instant silence. Wang stood up and looked around the field. The wheat swayed. The night was coming again. "The fire," the partner said, gesturing to the burns. "Why burn her?" "Destruction of evidence," Wang mused. "DNA? Or maybe..." He trailed off. He looked at the violence of it. The specific focus on the lower body. Or maybe it's a ritual. Maybe it's shame. Or maybe he just likes to watch it burn. "Robbery? The bike and wallet are gone," Wang agreed. "But that feels secondary. An afterthought. He didn't kill her for the money. He killed her because he wanted to kill her. The theft is just a bonus." Wang looked toward the village lights flickering in the distance. They were so close, just a few hundred yards. People were eating dinner, watching TV, living their lives. "He did this right under their noses," Wang said. "He spent time here. 30 minutes? An hour? He wasn't afraid of being caught. He was comfortable." Local? The partner asked. Has to be, Wang said. He knows the fields. He knows the shortcuts. He knew no one would come down this path after dark. The wind picked up. The temperature dropped. The body of Jia Zhaoni was zipped into a black bag. The sound of the zipper was loud in the quiet field. Asterisk. Z-zip. Asterisk. It was the sound of a life being closed out. As they loaded her into the van, the father arrived at the police line. He didn't scream. He didn't fight the officers holding him back. He just collapsed. He fell to his knees in the dirt, his mouth open in a silent howl, his soul shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The detectives watched him. They felt the weight of it. "We have to catch this guy," the partner said. "Fast." Wang lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating his tired face. He looked out into the darkness, into the endless ocean of wheat. "We're not looking for a guy," Wang said. "We're looking for a ghost." Months passed. The wheat turned from green to gold, then to brown. It was harvested. The fields were laid bare, stripping the land of its secrets. But the killer was gone. The investigation stalled. The clues were sparse. No fingerprints on the dirt. The rain had washed away the tire tracks. The bicycle never surfaced in any pawn shop. The wallet was never found. The village of Shangbei lived in a state of suspended terror. Women stopped going out after dark. The rhythm of the village changed. Doors were bolted before the sun went down. The bicycle bell, once a cheerful sound, became a trigger for anxiety. But time is a narcotic. Slowly, the fear began to dull. The sharp edge of panic softened into a dull ache. People told themselves it was a one-time thing, a drifter passing through, a madman who had moved on to another province. The harvest ended. The winter came. The fields lay fallow, covered in a thin layer of frost. The police task force was downsized. Resources were drained by other crimes in the city: gang violence, corruption, theft. The file on Jia Zhaoni began to gather dust. It sat on the corner of Detective Wang's desk, a silent accusation. Then came December. 15 December 1997. It was a Monday, cold. The sky was the color of a bruise. In Taiping village, just 3 miles west of Shangbei, the pattern repeated. A young woman named Liu failed to come home for dinner. Her family searched. They called the police. They prayed it was a misunderstanding. She was found the next morning. She was in a cornfield this time, or what was left of it. The dry, broken stalks rattling in the winter wind. Detective Wang stood over the body. The air was freezing, his breath pluming in front of him, but he felt a flash of heat that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the heat of recognition. The victim was on her back, strangled, eyes bulging, tongue protruding, and burned. The lower body was charred black. The smell, that same distinctive nightmare smell of roasted meat and chemicals, wafted up from the frozen ground. Wang felt a pit open in his stomach, a sensation of falling. "He's back," the partner said, his voice a whisper. Wang shook his head. He looked at the horizon, at the vast, sprawling network of villages and fields that surrounded the city of Xi'an. "He never left," Wang said. "He's been here the whole time, watching, waiting." The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. They were standing in the hunting ground of a predator who had no intention of stopping. The monster wasn't a drifter. He was a neighbor. He was someone who walked these roads, bought cigarettes at the local store, and smiled at children. And as the snow began to fall, covering the charred remains in a blanket of white, the detectives knew one thing with absolute, terrifying certainty. He was just getting started. He was just getting started. The realization didn't come as a shout. It settled over Detective Wang and his partner like the heavy, wet snow that was beginning to blanket the charred remains of the girl in the cornfield. It was a cold, quiet understanding, the kind that sinks into the marrow and stays there. They weren't dealing with an interruption in the social order. They were dealing with a new law of nature. The winter of 1997 bled into the spring of 1998. and the landscape of Chang'an County underwent a fundamental psychological shift. The physical geography remained the same: the flat, endless expanse of the Guangzhou Plain, the irrigation ditches cutting through the soil like scars, the clusters of villages that looked like islands in a sea of dirt. But the internal geography was rewritten. Fear became the weather. It wasn't a sharp, panic-induced fear anymore. It was a dull, chronic condition. It was the way a mother gripped her daughter's wrist, a little too tight, at the market. It was the way men stopped playing cards outside after dusk, retreating behind locked gates. It was the way the bicycle, once the symbol of freedom and mobility in rural China, became a vessel of vulnerability. To ride a bike alone at night was to invite the devil. The 13th of February, 1998. The Lunar New Year had just passed. The red lanterns were still hanging from the eaves of the houses in Nanfeng village, limp and sodden from the winter rains. The air smelled of sulfur from spent firecrackers and the thick, coal-heavy smoke of heating stoves. It was a time for family, a time for reunion. But for one family, it was the end of time. The call came into the station at 7 a.m. A farmer, walking the perimeter of his land to check for frost damage, had found something in a drainage ditch. Wang took the call. He didn't ask what it was. He just grabbed his coat. He knew. The pattern had etched itself into his brain. When they arrived, the scene was almost insultingly familiar. The victim was young. She had been on her way home. She had been intercepted. The violence was escalating. In the previous cases, there was a sense of control, a clinical, almost surgical efficiency to the strangulation. But this was rage. The girl's face was unrecognizable, not just from the decomposition, but from the force applied. The killer hadn't just stopped her breathing. He had tried to tear her apart. And the fire. He was getting better at the fire. In the earlier cases, the burns were localized, almost tentative, like he was experimenting. Now, the lower half of the body was decimated. The accelerant was stronger. The heat had been more intense. The smell of gasoline mixed with the organic rot of the ditch, creating a perfume of pure malice. Wang stood on the edge of the ditch, his boots sinking into the mud. He looked at the horizon. The sun was trying to break through the gray overcast, but the light was weak. It offered no warmth. "He's mocking us," his partner said. He was a younger man, still capable of shock. He was green enough to take it personally. He knows we're out here. He knows we're looking, and he does this right under our noses. Wang lit a cigarette. His hands were steady, but inside, he felt a vibration, a tremor. "He doesn't care about us," Wang said. "We aren't part of his equation. We're just the janitors. We clean up the mess after he's had his fun." "We need more men," the partner said. "We need checkpoints. We need to lock this whole district down." "You can't lock down the wind," Wang said, exhaling smoke. "Look at this place." He gestured to the miles of open fields, the hundreds of dirt paths, the thousands of hiding spots. "It's a labyrinth. He lives here. He breathes this air. To catch him, we have to be everywhere at once." The months that followed were a blur of failure. Spring arrived. The crops began to rise again. The wheat, the corn, the sorghum. The land turned green, lush and beautiful. But to the police, the growth was just a complication. The tall crops were accomplices. They provided cover. They turned every field into a killing room. The killer accelerated. The timeline compressed. It wasn't months between attacks anymore. It was weeks, sometimes days. March, April, May. The reports stacked up on Wang's desk. A tower of misery. Attempted abductions, sexual assaults, murders. The modus operandi shifted slightly, adapting to the circumstances. But the signature remained the same. The ambush, the choke, the fire. The killer was feeding. He was in a frenzy. It was as if he was trying to fill a bottomless void inside himself, pouring violence into it, but the void only grew wider. The task force was running on fumes. They slept in the station. They ate instant noodles that tasted like cardboard. They interviewed hundreds of men, drifters, laborers, ex-cons, weirdos. They brought them in, sweated them, and let them go. None of them had the strength. None of them had the darkness. The killer was a phantom. He left no fingerprints. He left no DNA that matched the database. He seemed to materialize out of the darkness, strike with the force of a natural disaster, and then dissolve back into the mist. The villagers began to whisper about spirits. They talked about a ghost that walked the fields, a demon that fed on the breath of young women. Wang hated the ghost talk. Ghosts were easy. You couldn't handcuff a ghost. You couldn't put a ghost against a wall and scream until it told you the truth. This was a man, flesh and blood. A man who ate dinner, who went to the toilet, who slept in a bed. And that made it worse, because it meant that a human being was capable of this. Summer hit Chang'an County like a hammer. The heat was oppressive. The humidity turned the air into soup. The smell of the fields, fertilizer, growth, rot was overwhelming. August, September, October. 8 more cases. The countryside was a war zone without soldiers. Just victims and a sniper who never missed. Then, on November 1st, the dynamic shifted. The universe, seemingly tired of the killer's winning streak, threw the dice. It was a Tuesday evening. A woman named Lee was riding home. She was older than the other victims, in her early 30s. Stronger. She worked in the fields. Her hands were calloused. Her back was broad. She took the path near the brick kilns. It was a shortcut she had taken 1,000 times. The attack came from the left. A shadow detached itself from the cornstalks. It moved with that terrifying, silent speed. The collision was violent. Lee was knocked from her bike, hitting the ground hard. But she didn't freeze. When the hands clamped around her throat, she didn't go limp. She exploded. She kicked. She clawed. She twisted her body, using her weight against him. She jammed her thumbs into his eyes. She raked her fingernails across his face, tearing skin. He was surprised. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the predator had miscalculated. He had expected a lamb, and he had grabbed a wolf. He panicked. He struck her, hard, a blow to the temple that made the world go white. He tore at her clothes, desperate to regain control, desperate to finish the ritual. He managed to drag her into the ditch. He managed to get his hands back on her throat. But the element of surprise was gone. A tractor was approaching on the main road, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The engine noise grew louder. The killer hesitated. In that second of hesitation, Lee screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of rage. The killer broke. He released her. He scrambled up the bank of the ditch, his breathing ragged, and vanished into the high corn. Lee lay in the mud, gasping for air, her throat burning, her body bruising. But she was alive. She was the first one to come back from the dead. The hospital room was sterile and white. Detective Wang sat by the bed. He looked at Lee with a reverence, usually reserved for religious icons. She was swollen. Her neck was a band of purple and black bruises. Her eyes were bloodshot. But she was lucid. "Tell me," Wang said softly. "Tell me everything." Lee spoke in a rasp. Every word was a struggle, but she forced them out. "He was small," she whispered. "Not a giant. Thin, wiry, like old rope." Wang wrote it down. Asterisk. Small build. Thin. Asterisk. Smell? Wang asked. "Sweat," she said. "Stale sweat and dirt, like he works in the earth." "Did he speak?" "Yes," Lee said. She closed her eyes, remembering. "He cursed at me when I kicked him," he said. "He said, 'You bitch, stop moving.'" The accent, Wang pressed. "Where was he from?" Lee opened her eyes. "Southern Shanxi." Definitely. The way he curled his tongue. It wasn't local dialect. It was from the mountains. Wang felt a jolt of electricity. This was it. This was the thread they had been groping for in the dark. A sketch artist was brought in. Lee described the face that had hovered over hers in the moonlight. Sharp chin, narrow eyes, a small, flat nose, rat-like. The drawing that emerged was not the face of a monster. It was the face of a nobody. A face you would pass on the street and forget instantly. The face of a man who blended into the background. Wang took the sketch. He looked at it for a long time. "Print it," he said. Get it to every village chief, every factory foreman, every shopkeeper within 50 miles. The dragnet tightened. 2 days later, an old man in a village near the brick kilns squinted at the flyer. He tapped the paper with a gnarled finger. "I know him," the old man said. "That's Song Chang'an. Who is he?" the officer asked. "He worked at the kiln," the old man said. "Quiet guy, weird, always watching the women when they rode by. He left a few days ago, said he was going back home to Zhunyang, southern Shaanxi." The pieces clicked into place with the satisfying sound of a revolver hammer being cocked. The police moved fast. A convoy of cars tore down the highway, heading south into the mountains. They found Song's family home, a shack clinging to the side of a steep hill. They didn't knock. They kicked the door in. Song Qianping was eating dinner. When he saw the uniforms, he didn't ask why. He didn't act confused. He dropped his bowl and ran for the back window. He didn't make it. 3 officers tackled him. They dragged him out into the dirt, handcuffed him, and threw him into the back of a van. Wang sat in the passenger seat as they drove back to Xi'an. He looked back at Song through the wire mesh. Song was small, wiry. He looked like a rat trapped in a cage. Asterisk. "We got him." Asterisk, Wang thought. Asterisk. "It's over." Asterisk. The interrogation room was a box of pressure. The air was hot and stagnant. A single bulb buzzed overhead. Song Qianping sat handcuffed to the chair. He was trembling. He was crying. He wasn't a stoic psychopath. He was a coward. Wang leaned across the table. He put the photo of Li on the metal surface. "You know her," Wang said. Song looked at the photo and sobbed. "I didn't mean to," he blubbered. She provoked me." "You attacked her," Wang said. "Yes," Song wept. "Yes, I did." "And the others?" Wang asked. His voice dropped an octave. He pulled out the photos of the dead, the burned, the broken. He laid them out like a tarot spread of hell. "Tell me about them, Song. Tell me about the fire." Song stopped crying. He looked at the photos. His eyes went wide. He recoiled, pressing his back against the chair. "No," Song whispered. "No, no, no. Don't lie to me." Wang slammed his hand on the table. "You killed them. You burned them." "I didn't," Song screamed. I swear on my mother's grave, I attacked women. Yes, I raped some. I admit it. I'm a beast. Shoot me." "But I didn't kill them. I never killed anyone." Wang stared at him. He was looking for the tell, the lie. But Song looked terrified. Not of the police, but of the photos. "I ran away," Song stammered. "I attacked the lady on the bike, but she screamed. I got scared. I ran. I didn't burn her. I don't know anything about burning." "We'll see," Wang said coldly. "We have your DNA, Song. We have samples from the bodies. Science doesn't lie." They took the swabs. They sent them to the lab. The waiting began again. Wang paced the hallway. He smoked a pack of cigarettes. He felt good. He felt like the weight was finally lifting. Song fit the description. He had confessed to the attack on Li. He was a predator. 12 hours later, the lab tech walked in. He looked pale. He held a clipboard. Wang stood up. "Well?" The tech shook his head. "It's a mismatch," the tech said softly. Wang felt the floor drop out from under him. "What?" "Song is a match for the rape of the survivor, Li. He's also a match for 5 other sexual assaults in the area. We have him on those. He's going away for life." "But the murders?" Wang asked. "The burnings?" "No match," the tech said. "The semen found on the burned victims. It's not Song. It's someone else." Wang slumped into his chair. He put his head in his hands. Song Qianping was a monster. He was a serial rapist. He had terrorized the countryside. But he wasn't the Times monster. He was just a wolf. The tiger was still out there. The investigation lurched forward, wounded. The morale in the squad room was subterranean. They had celebrated prematurely. They had allowed themselves to hope. But Detective Wang refused to stop. He was fueled by a cold, hard rage now. "If there's one, there's another," Wang told his team. We shook the tree and a rat fell out. Let's shake it harder. They went back to the files. They looked at the unsolved cases again. They looked for outliers. A witness came forward regarding a murder from September. A farmer who had been afraid to speak up before. I saw a man, the farmer said, near the cornfield where the girl was found. He was washing his hands in the irrigation ditch. It was late. He looked wrong. Describe him, Wang said. Big, the farmer said. Shoulders like a bull, shaved head. He looked like Zhang Yuping. Wang knew the name. Zhang Yuping was a local thug, a man with a history of violence as long as his arm. Assault, robbery, extortion. He was a blunt instrument. Where is he? Wang asked. Gone, the farmer said. Disappeared right after that night. Left his wife, left his kid. Just vanished. Another suspect. Another hunt. But this time, they didn't rush. They stalked. They found out that Zhang had been spotted sneaking back into his village at night to steal food. He was living feral, hiding in the abandoned storage sheds, sleeping in haylofts. The police set up a perimeter. It was mid-November now. The cold had returned with a vengeance. The officers lay in the frozen ditches, covered in camouflage, watching Zhang's house. They waited for 3 nights. Their bones ached. Their breath turned to ice on their lips. On November 19, a taxi rolled into the village. It moved slowly, lights off. The door opened. A large man stepped out. He was hunched over, looking left and right. Go, Wang whispered into his radio. The team swarmed. Zhang Yuping was strong. He fought. He threw one officer into a wall. He punched another in the throat. But there were too many of them. They brought him down under a pile of bodies. In custody, Zhang was different from Song. He was sullen, angry. Yeah, I killed her, Zhang grunted, spitting on the floor. The bitch saw me stealing the taxi. She was going to tell, so I hit her with a rock. And the others? Wang asked. The strangled ones? The burned ones? Zhang frowned. I don't burn people. I'm not a freak. I hit her with a rock. That's it. Wang felt the familiar sinking sensation. Zhang's confession was specific. He knew details only the killer would know about the rock, about the taxi. But he knew nothing about the wire, nothing about the fire. Another monster caught, another killer off the streets, but still not times him asterisk. November 24th, 1978. Song was in a cell. Zhang was in a cell. The police station was full of bad men. The radio on Wang's desk crackled to life. It was the night shift patrol. Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We have a 10 to 54 at the edge of Liu Village. Wang picked up the microphone. His hand felt heavy. Unit 4, go ahead. It's another one, Detective. The silence on the radio was thick with static. Female. Young. Found in the wheat stubble. Wang closed his eyes. Condition? Strangled. The officer's voice came back, trembling. And, Jesus, Detective, she's burned. Lower body, just like the others. Wang let the microphone drop. It hit the desk with a dull thud. Song was locked up. Zhang was locked up. And the smoke was still rising from the fields. The logic of the investigation shattered. They had been working on the assumption that this was a recent phenomenon, a spree that started in 1997. They had been looking for a trigger event, a divorce, a job loss, something that snapped in a man's mind 2 years ago. But they were wrong. Wang stood up. He walked to the archives room. It was a dusty, windowless basement filled with cardboard boxes. The smell of old paper and mildew was overpowering. We're looking at it wrong, Wang said to his partner, who had followed him down. We're looking at the surface. We need to look at the roots. They started pulling boxes. Not from 1997. Not from 1996. They went back. 1995 1994 1993 1992 They sat on the concrete floor, surrounded by files, reading through the handwritten reports of village police officers who had long since retired. The 2nd of June, 1992, Wang read aloud. His voice was hollow. Wang Yingying, 20 years old, found in a cornfield, strangled. partially burned. He opened another file. August 1993. Unidentified female. Found in a dry riverbed. Strangled. Burned. May 1994. 2 attacks in 1 week. Both survived, but described a man who tried to choke them from behind. The room seemed to spin. The timeline expanded, stretching out like a dark stain across the decade. He didn't start last year, Wang whispered. He's been here the whole time. They did the math. They tallied the numbers, excluding the crimes committed by Song and Zhang. They stripped away the noise and looked at the signal. From 1992 to 1998, 51 attacks, 20 dead. This wasn't a spree. This was a career. The killer wasn't a frenzy-driven madman who would burn out. He was a creature of habit. He was a part of the ecosystem. He was as much a feature of the Chang'an countryside as the locusts or the droughts. He hunted when the crops were high. He rested when the snow fell. He had a rhythm, a season. Wang looked at the stack of 51 files. They towered over him. Each folder was a life ruined. Each folder was a family destroyed. And the man who did it was still out there. He was probably sleeping right now. Maybe he was a father. Maybe he was a husband. Maybe he was the man who sold you vegetables, or the man who fixed your bicycle chain. Wang walked out of the station. It was deep night. The air was freezing. He looked out toward the darkness where the fields began. The city lights ended abruptly, swallowed by the void of the rural expanse. Somewhere in that silence, a bicycle bell rang in his memory. Asterisk. Chink, chink, chink. Asterisk. The waiting wasn't over. The ghost was still hungry. The realization hit Detective Wang not like a slap, but like a slow-acting poison. It was a cold, creeping numbness that started in his fingertips and worked its way to his heart. He stood in the doorway of the station, the freezing night air biting at his exposed face. But he couldn't feel the cold. He could only feel the weight of the years. It wasn't just a date on a file. It was a readjustment of reality. For months, they had been operating under the assumption that they were hunting a man who had snapped recently. A man triggered by the social changes of the late 90s, by financial stress, by some sudden break in his psyche. They were looking for a novice, a beginner. But the monster had been walking among them for 6 years. Wang turned back into the station. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a sick, yellow hum. He walked past the holding cells where Song and Zhang were sleeping. 2 violent men, 2 predators. Yet compared to the shadow they were hunting, they were nothing more than scavengers. They were bottom feeders, eating the scraps left by the apex predator. Wang returned to the archives. He sat on the floor, surrounded by the smell of dust and decaying paper. He opened the file for the 2nd of June 1992. Wang Yingying. He looked at her photo. She was smiling, wearing a white blouse with a frilled collar, typical of the early 90s. She looked innocent, unmarked. Then he turned the page to the crime scene photos. The bile rose in Wang's throat. He had seen death. He had seen accidents, suicides, gang fights. But this was different. This was a language of hate he was only just beginning to learn to read. She had been found in a cornfield, just like the others. But the killer hadn't just ended her life. He had tried to erase her humanity. The strangulation was fierce, breaking the hyoid bone, crushing the windpipe. But it was what came after that made Wang's hands shake. The burning. It wasn't just destruction of evidence. It was a ritual. Even back then, in 1992, the signature was there. The localization of the fire. The specific targeting of the lower body. And there was something else in the report. A detail the younger officers hadn't mentioned because they hadn't known to look for it. A corn cob. It had been used to violate the body post-mortem. It was an act of such profound disrespect, such unnecessary cruelty, that it spoke of a deep, festering hatred for women. Not for a specific woman, but for times women asterisk, for the very idea of them. Wang closed the file. He felt sick. He picked up the next one. 1993. The body in the riverbed. Then 1994. As he read, the timeline constructed itself in his mind. A dark architecture of suffering. The killer wasn't a phantom. He was a neighbor. He was someone who had lived through the changing seasons of the Guangzhou Plain. He had watched the crops go in, and he had watched the crops come down. He had watched the paved roads replace the dirt tracks. He had watched the red lanterns fade and the neon signs flicker to life. And through it all, he had hunted. He was disciplined. That was the most terrifying realization. Song Chenping had attacked Li because he was impulsive, a creature of immediate gratification. He saw an opportunity, and he took it. And because he was impulsive, he failed. He panicked. The true killer didn't panic. In 51 attacks, he had left no DNA that they could trace to a suspect. He left no fingerprints. He didn't drop his wallet. He didn't let his victim scream until it was too late. He was a professional. Not in the sense of a hitman, but in the sense of a craftsman. Murder was his trade. The cornfields were his workshop. Wang lit a cigarette, ignoring the no smoking sign. The smoke curled up into the stagnant air. "He's watching us," Wang whispered to the empty room. He realized then that the killer likely knew about the arrests. He knew Song and Zhang were in custody. He probably read the papers. He probably sat in a noodle shop, slurping broth, listening to the locals gossip about how the police had caught the beast. And he was probably laughing. Not a loud, villainous laugh, but a quiet, internal smirk, because he knew he was safe. The police had their trophies. The public had their scapegoats. The pressure was off. And when the pressure is off, the hunter returns to the blind. Winter deepened. The year turned. 1999 arrived, not with fanfare, but with a gray, suffocating blanket of fog. The investigation into the true killer went underground. Publicly, the police celebrated the capture of Song and Zhang. They had to. The community needed a win. They needed to believe the nightmare was over so they could sleep at night. But inside the major crimes unit, there was no celebration. There was only a grim, grinding determination. They mapped the attacks. They put pins in a giant wall map of Chang'an County. The pins clustered in the rural zones, away from the highways, away from the cameras. They formed a constellation of death that mirrored the irrigation networks. "He knows the water," Wang said one morning, tracing the lines of the canals with his finger. "Look. Almost every body was found near a drainage ditch, a canal, or a dry riverbed." "Access," his partner said. "He uses the maintenance paths, the paths the tractors use, the paths that aren't on the official maps." "It means he's mobile," Wang said, "but not by car. A car is too loud, too noticeable, in these villages where everyone knows everyone's vehicle." "A bicycle?" "Maybe," Wang said. "Or a motorbike. Something small, something he can push into the tall grass and hide." They tried to profile him. He was strong. He could subdue a struggling woman in seconds. He was patient. He waited for hours in the freezing cold or the sweltering heat. He was local. He knew the harvest cycles. He knew when the corn was high enough to cover a body, and when the wheat was too short to provide cover. They cross-referenced workers, irrigation specialists, field hands, itinerant laborers who moved with the harvest. They interviewed 3,000 men. 3,000. They took swabs. They checked alibis. They looked into eyes that were tired, angry, scared, and indifferent. And they found nothing. It was as if the earth itself was swallowing the women and spitting them back out broken. The frustration began to eat at the team. Marriages fell apart. Alcoholism spiked among the detectives. Wang found himself waking up at 3 a.m., sweating, hearing the phantom sound of a bicycle bell. Asterisk. Chink, chink, chink. Asterisk. He would drive out to the fields in the middle of the night. He would park his unmarked car on the edge of a dirt road and just sit there, watching the darkness. He wanted the killer to appear. He wanted to see a shadow move. He wanted a confrontation, but the fields were silent. The wind whispered through the dry stalks, mocking him. Asterisk. "You are too late." Asterisk. The wind seemed to say. Asterisk. "You are always too late." Asterisk. Spring 1999. The crops began to rise again. The cycle restarted. The fear in the villages had abated slightly. The arrests of Song and Zhang had acted as a sedative. Women were riding their bikes again. Not as late, perhaps, and not as alone, but the paralyzed terror of the previous winter had thawed. Wang watched this return to normalcy with a sense of impending doom. He felt like a meteorologist watching a hurricane form offshore, while the people on the beach continued to swim. "He's going to strike again," Wang told his superior. "He's rested. He's let the heat die down." "We can't patrol every acre, Wang," the chief said, rubbing his temples. "We don't have the manpower. We have Song. We have Zhang. Maybe the DNA lab made a mistake. Maybe it times one of them." "It wasn't," Wang said. "You know it wasn't." "Let it go, Wang." But he couldn't. On April 4th, the silence broke. It wasn't a murder. It was a sighting. A young school teacher was riding home near the village of Xinjie. It was dusk. The sky was a bruised purple. She heard something behind her, the soft crunch of tires on gravel. She sped up. The sound behind her sped up. She glanced back. A man on a heavy black bicycle. He was wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled low. He wasn't trying to pass her. He was matching her pace, staying exactly 10 meters behind. She turned a corner. He turned. She felt the cold hand of instinct grip her spine. She knew, with absolute certainty, that if she stopped, she would die. She pedaled harder. Her lungs burned. The school was still a mile away. The road was empty. The man behind her accelerated. He was silent. No shouting. No catcalling. Just the mechanical whir of the chain and the heavy breathing of a predator closing the gap. She saw the lights of a small tractor station ahead. A group of men were smoking outside, finishing their shift. She screamed, "Help! Help me!" The men looked up. The cyclist behind her slammed on his brakes. He didn't turn around. He simply veered off the road, hopping the curb, and drove his bike straight into the dense tree line of a pear orchard. He vanished. The teacher collapsed in front of the mechanics, sobbing, hyperventilating. When Wang interviewed her, she was shaking so hard she couldn't hold a glass of water. "Did you see his face?" Wang asked, his voice gentle. "No," she wept. "Just his back. He was broad, strong, and he smelled." "Smelled of what?" "Smoke," she said. "Not cigarettes, wood smoke, and something sharp, like gasoline." Wang closed his eyes. He was still there. They searched the pear orchard. They found tire tracks, deep ruts in the soft soil, indicating a heavy rider or a heavy bike. The tracks led to an irrigation canal and then disappeared onto the hard-packed mud of the maintenance road. He had escaped again. But this encounter told Wang something important. The killer was evolving, or perhaps devolving. He was taking risks, chasing a woman near a station with witnesses. That was bold, or it was desperate. The hunger was growing. The void inside him was widening. The summer of 1999 was a blur of near misses and false alarms. Every shadow was a suspect. Every man on a bike was a potential monster. But the bodies stopped appearing. This was the cruelest twist of all. The killer seemed to have gone dormant. Had he moved? Had he died? Had he been arrested for something else? A petty theft? A drunk driving charge and was sitting in a cell under a false name? Or was he just waiting? Wang spent his nights poring over the old files. 1992 through 1998. 51 attacks, 20 dead. He memorized their names. He memorized the locations. He tried to find the geometric center of the crimes, hoping it would point to a house, a village, a lair. But the center of the crimes was nowhere. It was everywhere. It was the landscape itself. The killer was a part of the geography. He was the heat in the summer. He was the frost in the winter. He was the inevitable violence of the natural world. As the millennium approached, the case went cold, truly cold. The task force was disbanded. The officers were reassigned. The files were boxed up and moved to the damp basement, stacked next to petty larcenies and traffic accidents. Wang stayed on. He became the ghost of the department, the old man who wouldn't let go. He grew gray, his back stooped, but his eyes remained sharp, always scanning the faces in the crowd, always looking for the man who didn't quite fit, or perhaps the man who fit too well. Years passed. Chang'an County changed. The dirt roads were paved over with asphalt. The cornfields were sold to developers. High-rise apartment blocks began to sprout from the earth where the wheat once grew. The hiding places were disappearing. The era of the bicycle ended. Electric scooters and cars took over. The silence of the rural night was replaced by the hum of the city expanding, eating the countryside. But the mystery remained, a scar on the land. Sometimes, Wang would drive out to the location where Jia Xiaoni was found in 1997. It was no longer a field. It was the parking lot of a logistics center. Trucks rumbled over the spot where she had bled. He would stand there, amidst the diesel fumes and the noise, and try to feel the presence of the evil that had stood there before. But there was nothing, just concrete. The killer had won, not because he had escaped justice, but because he had outlasted it. He had committed his atrocities and then simply stopped or moved on. He had denied them the satisfaction of a conclusion. He had denied them a face to hate. He remained a shadow, and that was the true horror. If they had caught him, if they had found a drooling madman or a cold-eyed sadist, they could have processed it. They could have said, "This is evil, and we have caged it." They could have drawn a line between the human world and the monster. But without a face, the monster was everyone. He was the man packing groceries. He was the taxi driver. He was the grandfather walking in the park. The DNA remained in the database, a string of numbers and markers with no name attached to it. A silent accuser, waiting for a match that might never come. In the end, Detective Wang retired. He went home to his garden. He tried to find peace. But every time he saw a fire burning in the distance, farmers burning the straw after the harvest, he would freeze. The smell of the smoke would drift on the wind, acrid and heavy. And he would be back there, standing in the mud, looking at the charred remains of a life that had barely begun. The story of the Chang'an monster isn't a story of triumph. It isn't a police procedural where the good guys outsmart the bad guy in the final act. It is a story about the vastness of the world and the smallness of justice. It is a story about how easy it is to destroy a life and how hard it is to protect one. The 51 files are still in the basement. The paper is yellowing, the ink is fading, the rubber bands are snapping with age. But the truth inside them hasn't aged. Somewhere, a man is walking free. He is old now. Perhaps his hands shake. Perhaps his memory is failing. Does he remember them? Does he remember the smell of the gasoline? Does he remember the sound of the bicycle bells ringing in the dark? Or has he forgotten them? Just as the world has tried to move on. The fields are gone. The corn is gone. But the darkness remains. It has just changed shape. It lives in the alleyways between the high-rises now. It lives in the blind spots of the surveillance cameras. The predator adapts. And as you sit there, listening to this, safe in your room, with the door locked and the lights on, remember one thing. The distance between civilization and the wild is not measured in miles. It is measured in seconds. It takes only seconds to be pulled from the light into the dark. It takes only seconds for a person to become a memory. And sometimes, there is no one coming to save you. Sometimes, the bell rings, and no one hears it. Stories like these don't end when the video ends. They stay with you, because the most unsettling part isn't what happened. It's what it says about people. Somewhere out there, these situations are happening right now, unnoticed, unquestioned. So, I want to ask you something. Which story disturbed you the most, and why? Let me know in the comments. If you want to hear more real stories that reveal the darker side of human nature, make sure to follow the channel. I'll see you in the next one.